Hello, welcome to the channel, Setting the Stage, Reality is Stranger Than Fiction, where we'll be discussing reality and all its strange intricacies. And we will be starting with the topic of reasonable faith in God. We'll be beginning here because without understanding or having an appreciation for faith in God, then it'll be difficult to understand the current scenario in the world today. So, to begin with, I would like to start with a Bible quote. It says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so they are without excuse." So Paul, writing to the Romans, is claiming that we all have the evidence of God within ourselves because it can be understood through what has been made, that God is the creator. So we should be able to look at the nature of our universe and our reality and see if it reveals a creator or not, or what type of creator it does reveal. Some questions. The cause of the universe. Now, this is where a lot of the discussions on reasonable faith in God begin, is the cause, along with, so the cause of the universe, was it on purpose or incidental? Obviously, an on purpose cause, someone consciously deciding to do something versus random natural events incidentally creating the universe. So, can the nature of the universe indicate its cause, whether it was on purpose or incidental? Was the cause of the universe internal or external to the universe? So, internal causes would rule out the biblical God, because the Bible reveals an external creator, since the biblical God existed prior to the creation of the universe with its space and time. So prior to the time is a property of this universe. So prior to the existence of the universe, there isn't necessarily time. So since the universe is finite, it reveals an external creator. Since time is a property of this universe, the external creator would be eternal. Okay, and we'll see how I can support that statement. If the nature of the universe was itself eternal, it would limit the chances of an external creator. Okay, so to understand reasonable faith in God, it's important to understand the concept of a cause, and we'll be discussing that, and we'll be discussing contingent versus necessary beings quite a bit in multiple arguments. So the first argument, pro-argument for the faith in God I will be discussing, is called the Kalam argument, or the Kalam cosmological argument. It comes from Kalam, medieval Islamic scholasticism. It was popularized by William Lane Craig in the Kalam cosmological argument of 1979. The Kalam cosmological argument is based on the concept of the prime mover introduced by Aristotle, which is another common theme in many of our arguments we'll be discussing, and entered early Christian or Neoplatonist, New Plato philosophy in late antiquity, being developed by John Philoponus. Along with much of classical Greek, the concept was adopted by Islamic theologians of the Sunni tradition. One of the earliest formulations of the cosmological argument comes from Al-Kindi. He writes, every being which has a cause for its being, every being which begins has a cause for its beginning. Now the world is a being which begins. Therefore, it possesses a cause for its beginning. Okay, another formulation of the argument is anything that begins to exist has a cause for its coming into being. The universe came into being. Therefore, the universe has a cause for its coming into being. Okay. The second statement was controversial for a time. Many scientific trains of thought looked into an eternal past universe. So a universe that did not come into being, a universe that always was. So if it doesn't come into being, it doesn't have a cause. So simply, the Kalam argument argues the universe came into being, and the universe has a cause for its coming into being. Now, most scientific thinkers or thought in general would say that the Big Bang caused the universe. Which is partially true, except for then what caused the Big Bang. The starting point of the Big Bang was the singularity. We're told that an ever-expanding universe in the future would be an ever-shrinking universe in the past. So if you extrapolate that back far enough, all of space and time would be condensed into a single point, the singularity. So the Big Bang caused the universe. What caused the Big Bang? Well, there was the presence of the singularity, but what caused that to expand, and where did the singularity come from? So I guess the ultimate question is, what caused the singularity? Obviously the Big Bang didn't. It's prior to the singularity, or prior to the Big Bang. The singularity is prior to the Big Bang. So what caused the singularity? And there are scientific explanations and theories. One of the most common ones is virtual particles. Virtual particles are said to, due to the properties of quantum mechanics, a virtual particle can pop into existence out of the empty vacuum of space. So, it's which virtual particles are theoretical and would not fully be a explanation for the cause of the singularity, because virtual particles become possible within the realm of the universe, which is not nothing. They have a field of energy within the space and time of the realm of this universe. So they do not begin from nothing. They are caused by the properties of quantum mechanics and come from an empty field, which a field is a property of the universe within space and time. So, very different from how could a singularity pop up outside. What outside forces? There is nothing outside the universe that we know of. So, an absolute nothing would not contain space, time, or fields. But it is suggested that since virtual particles are possible, it is possible that the singularity could come from nothing. Okay, so how the singularity came from nothing is not fully explained. One of the other extrapolations that comes from quantum mechanics is the multiverse. So in quantum mechanics, a particle only has the potential, and you make a measurement and you can find a particle in a certain position. But prior to that measurement, the particle existed as a wave and only had probability chances of being in one position, being found in a single position. So that collapses the wave function, which is said to a different observer could have found it in a different place or could have found nothing at all. And it is said that each measurement possibility becomes its own reality, and multiple verses pop up. So this universe could just be one of many universes. And they also there was often thought that the universe could expand and contract in a cycle, the cyclical. So it would expand and gravity would pull everything back together and cause a new singularity, which would expand, which would be pulled back together by gravity, and we would be in this eternal cycle. And that has been shown not to be possible. The universe is going to end, either most definitely because of entropy, and possibly because of dark energy causing the big rip. So the universe is not shrinking ever again. Its expansion is accelerating. Okay. So anything that begins to exist has a cause for its coming into being. The universe came into being. So this is, like I said, fundamental, because a past eternal universe would nullify this type of argument, because then if the universe always was, it didn't come into being, it just was, and it doesn't have a cause for its coming into being. Okay. Then a similar argument is the Leibnizian cosmological argument, and it states that anything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external explanation, which is known as a version of the PSR. The PSR is the principle of sufficient reason, and it states that everything must have a reason or a cause. The modern formulation of the principle is attributed to Gottfried Leibniz, although the idea was conceived and utilized by various philosophers who preceded him. Some philosophers have associated the principle of sufficient reason with ex nihilo nihil fit. Nothing comes from nothing. So from nothing comes nothing. So therefore, the universe is said to have a beginning, and that beginning has a cause. Okay, so the universe has an explanation for its existence, and that is grounded in a necessary being. The universe exists, therefore the universe has an explanation of its existence, therefore the explanation of the universe is grounded in a necessary being. Because a necessary being would not come into existence, but would always be. So since the universe came into existence, it is a contingent being. And it is explained by the presence of a necessary being. Okay, and this is all based on Aristotle's prime mover, the unmoved mover. And Thomas Aquinas picked up on this too, and he has the 5 ways. Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways, a very common place for any argument on the reasonable faith in God. And in summary, way 1 is called the unmoved mover. Like I said, that comes from Aristotle's prime mover. In the world, we can see that at least some things are changing. Whatever is changing is being changed by something else. If that by which it is changing is itself changed, then it too is being changed by something else. But this chain cannot be infinitely long, so there must be something that causes change without itself changing. This everyone understands to be God. Okay. And very similar to that is way 2, the uncaused cause. In the world, we can see that things are caused, but it's not possible for something to be the cause of itself, because this would entail that it exists prior to itself, which is a contradiction. If that by which it is caused is itself caused, then it too must have a cause, but this cannot be an infinitely long chain, so there must be a cause which is not itself caused by anything further. This everyone understands to be God. Okay. You combine that with the argument from the world as an interacting whole, the starting point. This comes from Peter Kreft's Handbook of Christian or Catholic Apologetics. Starting point, this world is given to us as a dynamic ordered system of many active components. Their natures are ordered to interact with each other in stable reciprocal relationships that we call physical laws. For example, every hydrogen atom in our universe is ordered to combine with every oxygen atom in a proportion of 2:1, which implies that every oxygen atom is reciprocally ordered to combine with every hydrogen atom in the proportion of 1:2. So it is with chemical valences of all the basic elements, so too all particles of mass are ordered to move toward every other according to fixed proportions of the law of gravity. In such an interconnected, interlocking dynamic system, the active nature of each component is defined by its relation with others and so presupposes the others for its own intelligibility and ability to act. Contemporary science reveals to us that our world system is not merely an aggregate of many separate unrelated laws, but rather a tightly interlocking whole. Their relationship to the whole structures and determines the parts. The parts can no longer be understood apart from the whole. Its influence permeates them all. Argument. Any such system as the above, like our world, no component, part, or active element can be self-sufficient or self-explanatory, for any part presupposes all the other parts. The whole system already in place to match its own reciprocal relational properties. It can't act unless the others are there to interact with reciprocally with it. Any one part could be sufficient only if it were the cause of the whole rest of the system, which is impossible, since no part can act except in collaboration with the others. Nor can the system as a whole explain its own existence, since it is made up of component parts and not a separate being in its own, independent of them. So neither the parts nor the whole are self-sufficient, neither can explain the actual existence of this dynamically interacting system. Okay, and then the argument from contingency, also found in the Handbook of Christian Apologetics. The basic form of this argument is simple. If something exists, there must exist what it takes for that thing to exist. The universe, the collection of beings in space and time, exists, therefore it must take what it takes for this universe to exist. What it takes for the universe to exist cannot exist within the universe or be bounded by space or time for reasons stated in the system as an interacting whole. Therefore, what it takes for the universe to exist must transcend both space and time. We spoke of the universe as the collection of beings. In space and time, consider one such being yourself. You exist and you are in part at least material. This means that you are a finite, limited, and changing being, for matter is a principle of limitation and change. Because you are limited and changing, you know that right now, as you read this book, you are dependent for your existence on beings outside you. Not your parents or grandparents, they may no longer be alive, but you exist now. And right now, you depend on many things in order to exist. For example, the air you breathe. To be dependent in this way is to be contingent. You must exist. You exist only if something else right now exists. Not everything can be like this, for then everything would need to be given being, but there would be nothing capable of giving it. There would not exist what it takes for anything to exist. So there must be something that does not exist conditionally. Something that does not exist only if something else exists. Something that exists in itself. What it takes for this thing to exist could only be this thing itself. Unlike changing material reality, there would be no distance, so to speak, between what this thing is and that it is. Obviously, the collection of beings changing in space and time cannot be such a being. Therefore, what it takes for the universe to exist cannot be identical with the universe itself or be part of the universe. And all these arguments can be proven by the Big Bang. The universe is finite, it has a beginning, it came into being, it has a cause for its being, and that cause cannot be itself. Another interesting side note is that Scripture tells us that the universe will end. Do not love the world or the things of the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world, and the world is passing away. 1 John 2:15. The day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away, the elements will melt, it will be burned up. All these things will be dissolved. The heavens will be dissolved, being on fire, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Science has proven the universe will end too. Entropy wins, and dark energy could cause the Big Rip. Okay. So our next argument comes from mostly from quantum mechanics. But to understand that, we should look at the argument from consciousness. Okay. Argument from consciousness is an argument for the existence of God based on consciousness. The argument from consciousness claims that human consciousness cannot be explained by the physical mechanisms of the body and brain, therefore asserting there must be non-physical aspects to human consciousness. This is held as indirect evidence of God, given that notions about souls in the afterlife would be consistent with such a claim. The argument may be stated in an inductive or deductive form. Inductive form, given theism and naturalism as live options fixed by our background beliefs, theism provides a better explanation of consciousness than naturalism and thus receives some confirmation from the existence of consciousness. Genuinely non-physical mental states exist. There is an explanation for the existence of mental states. Personal explanation is different from natural scientific explanation. The explanation for the existence of mental states is either a personal explanation or natural scientific. The explanation is natural scientific, therefore the explanation is not natural scientific. Therefore the explanation is personal experience. If the explanation is personal experience, it is theistic, therefore the explanation is theistic. Okay. Basically, this is a quote from Amit Goswami. Consciousness must be non-material. We have a non-material component within us. We have a material body, no doubt, but we have a non-material consciousness. So, consciousness is the only non-material thing that we know is real. Consciousness is our spirit, and if we have spirit, then spirits exist. This proof is in you and is you. When asked by the Pharisees when the kingdom of God would come, he answered and said, the kingdom of God does not come with observation, nor will they say, see here, see there, for indeed the kingdom of God is within you. Okay, so the argument from quantum mechanics is that non-material consciousness collapses the wave function. By extrapolation, that would be non-material consciousness is more real than material reality. More precisely, non-material consciousness is fundamental and material reality is contingent. So, in quantum mechanics, particles exist as particles and waves. Sometimes they display the properties of waves and sometimes the properties of particles. Particles and waves are contradictory properties. A particle should not act like a wave, and a wave should not act like a particle. Basically, particles are single points and waves are spread out. And you can see this most clearly through the double slit experiment. A single wave can enter 2 slits, but a single particle cannot. Okay, but what we see is that particles act like waves when they're not being measured. We can see this in the individual electron interference pattern buildup. So individual photons are fired through double slits. You fire enough of them and they form the interference pattern that a wave would form, a single wave would form passing through double slits. That means each individual particle is going through the double slits as a wave, interfering with itself, registering as a single point on the particle, or a single point on the screen. And if enough single particles are fired, their wave-like interactions will build up an interference pattern similar to a wave. So we see a person here with 2 balls making waves and an interference pattern. We see a single wave hitting 2 slits and creating the interference pattern. We see sunlight, the screen from sunlight passing through 2 slits, forming the interference pattern. Even the rainbow can be described by the wave, since different frequencies of waves cause different colors. And again, we can see individual electrons will build up this wave pattern over time if enough of them are fired. All right. So how does this prove an argument for the existence of God? Well, it is argued that a conscious observer collapses the wave function. Now, Neil deGrasse Tyson has said that the photons from the measurement devices collapse the wave function, which experiments have been devised where photons, and actually photons are always present, whether the particle registers as if it shows the interference pattern of a wave or not. So what happens is any attempt to know which slit a particle goes through will nullify the wave pattern, so that particles, if the which wave path is known, will not. So this is an example of a quantum eraser experiment where the which wave path is scrambled, and we can see the wave-like pattern of the individual electrons is present, and I'll explain how that happens here. And then the same setup where the which wave path is known destroys the interference pattern. So photons are present in both experiments. There's no physical difference that the photons go through to register as an interference pattern or to register without the interference pattern. Registering without the interference pattern shows the particles did not act like waves when being in between measurements, and the interference pattern does register, show that the particles acted like waves through prior to measurements. So which way the particle went, knowledge of that collapse, it gets rid of the interference pattern. So the particle acted like a particle the whole time between measurements. And like I said, the only thing that changes is our conscious knowledge of which way the particle went. If we don't know, the particle will act like a wave. If we do know, the particle will act like a particle. And the way this quantum eraser works is these are reflective mirrors. They pass half of the photons randomly. So half of them can land on either screen A or screen B. If it goes through slot A, that particle will land on detector A. If it goes through slot B or slit B, it will land on register B. Now these photons go through a prism, which takes one photon and breaks it in two. One of its pairs is registered on the detector and the other lands on the result screen. So when a photon is split like that, it becomes entangled. So any property you know about one of its entangled pair, you know about the other. So if you know the position of one of its entangled pair, you would know the position of the other entangled pair. So when you know if it goes through A or B, no interference pattern is present. If for the photons that pass through the screen to where they are not registered by A or B, they go back here and you have three screens. Now they all bounce off here. Half will bounce to C and half will go to D, scrambling the which way knowledge because you can't detect that. So now there's no way of knowing whether the photon went through A or B, and the interference pattern reappears. So destroying the which way knowledge will allow the particles to act like waves between detections. So the interesting thing about this is the results screen and whether they register on A or B happened before the knowledge gets scrambled. So these photons have already landed on the screen. Then the which way knowledge is scrambled, and still after the fact, after this has already occurred, this has passed through A or B and this photon has landed, then the which way knowledge gets scrambled, and still the particles that have already landed will form a interference pattern. So even though it's scrambled, it's landed, and then the information is scrambled later, these will align their position retroactively to the know which way path information knowledge for the measurer. So our knowledge of particle position will change the nature of the particle. In a universe where nature acted objectively, it shouldn't matter whether there's knowledge of which way a particle traveled. It should act the same whether there's which way path information or not. So our knowledge in our non-material consciousness affects the nature of reality. which basically, as Amit Goswami has said again, matter arises from consciousness, not consciousness arising from matter. And that is from the Quantum Activist film. So, if particles if our knowledge of a particle's position collapses the wave function, what collapses the wave function prior to conscious observers being able to detect which wave path information? The universe cannot form and evolution cannot occur if particles are in their wave state. So how would the universe develop a conscious observer to know which wave path information? This is why non-material consciousness is necessary, appears necessary, and physical materialness is contingent. And you can extrapolate this out into the argument from digital physics and simulation theory. Okay, because when you quantize the universe, it's almost as if you turn information into bits. Each quanti of light is not a continuous wave, it is also a particle. So everything is particleized or digitized. And since it looks like which way knowledge has an effect, this is where the argument from digital physics and simulation, the universe looks like a simulation, and many scientists argue that. They won't say the simulation is caused by God, but it does look like a simulation, which would be consistent with a universe that has a creator. Okay, so these are our arguments for reasonable faith in God, and what I would say is the natural God, the God that can be argued from these arguments, matches the Christian God of the Bible. He is eternal, he is the outside creator, and he is the consciousness from which the material universe comes from. Now we'll be discussing scriptures and prophecies, which the argument of fulfillment of prophecy can be its own pro-argument in discussing faith in God.